Well, I want to continue in our seminar. It's, as I was appreciating the baby dedication, a lot of times we might try to match a baby dedication and a sermon together, and I apologize, that really isn't happening because we're continuing in the seminar, but, we're going to be studying the Word of God, and part of faithfulness in parenting is being faithful to the Word of God as well. And so we praise God for the children that were dedicated and the families that have dedicated themselves to raise those children to love and to fear the Lord. But today in our seminars, we continue. We're going to be looking at America in prophecy. You know, when we think about our country, the country that we all live in, there's really a uniqueness about our country, promising and really bringing in a harbinger of liberty and freedom for all. But a question as we look at this subject today that I want to ask is, will these historic freedoms, will they ever be challenged? And we're going to be looking at this from the book of Revelation chapter 13. But before we go there, I want to begin with a story in the Old Testament that I believe helps us to understand the subject that we are going to be looking at today. Because we're asking the question, is America in prophecy? And are the freedoms that have been granted to us as a nation, as a people, will these freedoms ever be challenged? But there's some details in the prophecy we're looking at in Revelation 13 that are building upon a story back in the Old Testament. In 1 Kings chapter 17, we get our introduction to a man that is well known in prophecy or in the Bible, Elijah the Tishbite. And he marches in before wicked King Ahab, and as he comes before King Ahab, he has a startling message for Ahab. And what is this message? This message is, there will be no dew nor rain according to his word for these years. And so when we look at this, we see that Elijah delivers this message, and then he retires, and he goes to a place where God has directed him. The Bible calls it the brook Cherith. There was a brook there, and Elijah was provided there by the ravens. They would bring him his food every morning and every evening. But as time went on, what happens when there's no dew nor rain? Things start to get pretty dry, don't they? The brooks begin to dry up, and not only do the brooks begin to dry up, but the vegetation begins to fade. And when you're a nation like the nation of Israel, that was an agrarian nation that depended on farming for its entire economy, what do you think was happening to the entire nation of Israel during this time? It was an economic collapse, really, wasn't it? Because if there's no dew nor rain and they don't have irrigation, there's also no crops that are being harvested. And the animals that are surviving, they're having to look very hard to find food to provide for the animals. And so what do we see? We see here in this story that there was a drought that was brought on by the sins of the nation of Israel. And so their rebellion against God brought judgments upon them, which resulted in economic disaster and hardship. Now, it is very important to note, while there was hardship throughout the nation, was God taking care of Elijah? He wasn't he? In fact, when the brook Cherith dried up, God directed him to go to the Zarephath, and there in Zarephath he met a widow, and God miraculously provided for them with providing them the flour and the oil for them to have just enough for every day. You know, many times we want to have enough so that we feel secure, don't we? But God provides for us day by day, not necessarily year by year. And so every day there was more flour in the barrel, and they could make enough, a little food for them to eat that day, and it was gone. And then the next day there was a little bit more. God provides for our needs as we're faithful to Him. Aren't you thankful for that today? That God will provide for us. Now, He doesn't necessarily provide for all of our wants, but He does provide for our needs. 3.5 years go by, and as this time goes by, God speaks to Elijah and says, Elijah, I want you to go reveal yourself to King Ahab, and as you reveal him there, challenge them, as it were, to a discourse, to a time to come on Mount Carmel. So Elijah goes and he presents himself to King Ahab, and you read the story in 1 Kings chapter 18. And as Elijah comes before Ahab, Ahab says, is it you, you troubler of Israel? Elijah was the one that was getting blamed for the disasters, wasn't he? Elijah was the scapegoat. And Elijah, he's a very bold man. Elijah turns it around and says, I have not troubled Israel, but you and your house have, in that you have forsaken God's commandments and followed the Baals. Elijah is blamed for the disasters that come upon Israel, but Elijah says, no, I am not the cause, but you, in that you have rebelled against God's commandments, and that is what has brought disaster upon Israel. Elijah then challenges the priests and prophets of Baal to see whose God is the true God. He says, make an altar, put a sacrifice on it, and the God that answers by fire is the true God. And the story reads, you can read it this afternoon in 1 Kings chapter 18. The story reads that the prophets and the priests of Baal are dancing around, crying, even going to the extent of cutting themselves, and blood is gushing. But nothing happens. Hour after hour goes by until finally Elijah says it's time for God to reveal that He is the true God. And Elijah makes an altar to the Lord. And then as Elijah makes this altar to the Lord, he douses it with water. He says, not only are we going to make a sacrifice, but I'm going to show you that God alone is the one that is bringing this fire down. And so 3 times, they soak the altar and the sacrifice with water. Now, if you've ever tried to start a campfire in the rain, it's not so easy, is it? But not just was it a little sprinkle here, it was bucket loads, again and again and again. Humanly speaking, it was impossible for that sacrifice to be burned. But as Elijah prays, as he kneels down and he prays, asking God to bless and to show that He is the true God, fire flashes from heaven and consumes not only the sacrifice, not only the wood, but even the stones and the altar and everything that was there. And the people realize that God is the true God. Now, I want to notice some things from this story as we go on. As we go on, we see that there was disaster that came upon Israel because of their sins. Elijah rebuked their sins. Elijah was blamed for the disaster. And then we see fire came down from heaven and consumed the sacrifice. Remember those points as we transition now to Revelation chapter 13. Because in Revelation chapter 13, we see fire coming down from heaven again. But this time, when fire comes down from heaven in this last day scenario, it is not fire that comes from God, but it is a false fire that leads the world to receive the mark of the beast. Revelation chapter 13 and verse 13. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in the sight of the people, or in front of the people here. And so there's great signs. Fire comes down from heaven, and people are led because of this fire, but it's actually a false manifestation to be lead to the mark of the beast. Now, what is this power? What are the scenes that are going to develop? How will this come about? Well, we're going to go to Revelation 13 and verse 11. We're going to look at multiple points from this verse. Revelation 13, verse 11. In Revelation, we find first a beast that rises up out of the sea, having 7 heads, 10 horns, and it comes up out of the sea. There are 2 beasts in Revelation 13. The first is this beast that comes up out of the sea. The second is this beast we're just going to read about here in Revelation 13 and verse 11. Let's read it. Then I saw another beast rising up out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. Now John sees another beast coming up, and I want to notice some aspects about this other beast that is coming up. As this other beast is coming up, he says, Then I saw another beast. Well, it's giving us a time frame here. What is the time frame that it is giving us? Well, we already mentioned there's this first beast of Revelation chapter 13, and we studied last night that this power was going to continue for 1,260 years, or 42 months. And it was going to be a persecuting power. It was going to persecute God's people during this time. But we also saw that it was going to receive what the Bible refers to in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 3, a deadly wound. And we saw that in 1798, this power received a deadly wound when the lands of the church there were taken and declared for the Republic of France. And then the next thing that John sees, right after that, is he says, Then I saw another beast rising up out of the earth. So when did he see the other beast rising up out of the earth? It was not before this first beast of Revelation 13. It was right at the same time that this beast of Revelation 13 was coming up, or the one was going down and the other was coming up. So what time frame is that? That is around 1798, according to the prophecy. We're going to look at 5 identifying marks of this lamb-like beast in Revelation 13 and see if we can understand who or what this power is. So point number 1, it arises around 1798. But let's look at another aspect here. Same verse, then I saw another beast, and it was rising up. What does it say it was rising up out of? Out of the earth, wasn't it? I saw another beast rising up out of the earth. Now, what is significant about that? Well, we have to review a little bit because we've already studied a number of beasts. We've seen beasts in Bible prophecy represent kingdoms or nations. And so here, these other beasts of Revelation and of Daniel all rose not out of the earth, but they rose out of water. We saw that in Daniel chapter 7. There was the great sea, and the winds were stirring up this great sea, and one beast after another arose. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, and they came from the sea. We see that the first beast in Revelation also came from the sea. Well, what does that water represent? And that will help us to understand what the earth represents. Revelation chapter 17, verse 15 tells us what the water represents here. Notice we read it. Then he said to me, The waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. And so what, according to the Bible prophecy, does water represent here? Lots of people, right? People, multitudes, nations, and tongues. So we have dense population here. Now, if the other beast all rose up out of the sea, representing peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues, and the second beast doesn't rise up from the sea, it rises up from what? From the earth. That would be the opposite of the sea, right? And so what do you have here? You have a nation that would be coming up from a sparsely populated area. Does that make sense? Are you following me here? And so this would be a power that was going to come up out of a sparsely populated area. And so that's our second point, that it arises from a sparsely populated area. Notice another point here. This one's not as easy to see in the English. Then I saw another beast rising. That Greek word is anabino, which you don't have to remember, but it's used to represent slowly coming up or slowly growing to power. It's the same thing, for example, when Jesus gives the parable of the sower that goes out to sow the seed, and it says that the seed sprung up. That's the same Greek word, anabino. And it was coming up. It was growing like a plant. Have you ever planted a garden before? Do you harvest it the next day? No, you don't, do you? If you plant a garden, then it slowly grows, doesn't it? And it takes some time growing. This is my oldest daughter who no longer looks like that. Slowly it grows to power. This was going to be a nation that was going to grow like a plant. It was not going to suddenly conquer and suddenly be there. It was going to slowly grow. And so when we look at that, we have our third point. It's going to slowly arise. It's going to slowly grow to power. Look at our fourth point here. It's that we read here, it said, then I saw another beast rising out of the earth, and it had two horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. Notice it has two horns. Now what's significant about this is what is not on those horns. If we look at the first beast in Revelation 13, there are crowns on the horns. But do you see any crowns on this? No, not on the head, not on the horns, right? Who wears a crown? A king, doesn't it? It had two horns like a lamb, but there were no crowns on the horns of this second beast. What does this represent? The crowns represent kingly authority. And so this was going to be a nation that was not going to have a king or kingly authority. And so point 4 was going to be a power without a king. And one last point, which I believe is the most significant of all the points here, and that is it had two horns like, what does it say? Like a lamb. Now when you think about a lamb, what do you think about? Jesus, right? In fact, 26 times in the book of Revelation, the word lamb is used, actually 27 times. But 26 of those 27 times, the lamb clearly refers to Jesus. The 27th time is in this verse right here. And we see that if all the other times would, this, it seems like, would as well. So when we think of a lamb, we think of a peaceful, a gentle power, but it's also going to be a power that was going to be based upon Christ-like principles. What are some principles that Jesus taught? What are some principles that Jesus gives? Well, we read, for example, here in 2 Corinthians 3:17, now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is, what does it say? Liberty. Does Jesus teach liberty? Yeah, you know that one of the prophecies of Jesus in Isaiah chapter 61, verse 1, it says he's going to proclaim liberty to the captives. And so here we have liberty. Jesus gives liberty. Jesus not only gives liberty, but Jesus gives freedom. John chapter 8, verse 32, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall, what does it say? Make you free. Aren't you grateful about that? You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Does Jesus want to set us free? Jesus wants to give us freedom. It doesn't matter what we struggle with, what we're bound with, Jesus can set us free. I was visiting with a man one time who was actually a translator of mine, and he was telling me his story, how he had been terrible things had happened to him, and he was addicted to cocaine and all these other things, and he cried to Jesus at the at the lowest point in his life, and Jesus set him free. And he said, John chapter 8, verse 32 is my favorite verse, because Jesus set me free. And Jesus wants to set each of us free, doesn't he? It doesn't matter what chains bind us. Jesus can break those chains and he can set us free. And so Jesus gives liberty and freedom. You know, there's another very important principle that Jesus gave while he was on this earth, and this is in terms of perhaps national entities. It's one of the most significant principles and contributions that Jesus has given. We find it in Matthew chapter 22, verse 21. The Jews brought a question to Jesus, and they said, well, should we pay taxes or not? Nobody likes taxes, right? And they didn't either. And so said, should we pay taxes or not? And Jesus says, well, bring me a coin. And so they bring him a coin, and he says, well, whose image is on here? And then we pick it up in verse 21. They said to him, Caesar's. And he said to them, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Jesus gave a revolutionary principle here, one that was not followed by really anyone else before this. And he says, look, there's a duty to the state, and there's also a duty to God. You render the duty to the state or to Caesar, and you render duty to God. Notice what Jesus is talking about here. He's mentioning a separation between what we say in our American parlance today, a separation between church and state, right? Now, that wasn't just invented by the Constitution and Declaration of Independence and all of this. It was a principle that Jesus gave. Before that time, countries and their religion were always together. But Jesus says, no, you have a duty to the government that you live under. That's your duty to Caesar, so to speak. Caesar was the ruler at that time. But you have another duty, and that duty is to God. And he said, there's a separation there. And if those conflict, who should be higher in that? God. We ought to obey God rather than man as well, right? And so Jesus gave these very important principles for us. Jesus taught liberty, he taught freedom, and he taught separation of church and state. And I believe all of that is included in this idea when it's picturing these two horns like a lamb. And so I would say it's lamb-like. It's giving liberty and freedom for all. Now, we have 5 points that have all come from Revelation 13, verse 11. And when we look at these points, arises around 1798 from a sparsely populated area, slowly grows to power, without a king, giving and promising liberty and freedom to all, based on Christ-like principles. Now, when we look at that, is there a nation that fits that description? When we look at it, there's only one nation arising around 1798 from a sparsely populated area without a king that was slowly growing to power that was going to be based on Christ-like principles. And that nation can only be the United States, right? America in prophecy. And when we go back and we look at it, was it around 1798? Yeah. Declaration of Independence signed 1776, right? Constitution ratified 1789. And so we have these various things arising right during this period. Was the United States, was it slowly growing to power? Yeah, absolutely. I imagine that there are some here that would remember, maybe not quite, but would remember when we only had 48 stars on our flag, right? And that's because just, when was it, 1950s, something like that, that Alaska and Hawaii were added as states. And so when we see that, we see it slowly growing to power. It took a period of time without a king. And of course, we know that the United States was based on, at least from its 1776 on, was based on liberty and freedom. There were people that were wanting to practice and to follow their own faith without the hindrances and the control of a state government. And of course, that became enshrined in our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. But interesting, when we look at this, prophecy reveals that this power that began slowly and was going to grow to power and all of these things, and was based on Christ-like principles, that a change was going to take place. What is that change? Well, let's read it. Revelation 13:11. We're going to move on from this verse. I know we've read this verse like 5 times already, but we'll move on. Notice what it says at the very end. Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but what does it say it did? It spoke as a dragon. 2 horns like a lamb, but spoke like a dragon. Now, when we look at that, suppose you go up to this little lamb in the field, and you want to pet this little lamb. Would you expect it to roar like a dragon? Probably not, right? There's a contradiction in appearance there, isn't there? A contradiction from what it was or what it looks like to what it actually does or speaks. Now, very interesting. If we look in our history, there's been a contradiction in our history actually from the very beginning. We have these documents and a Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? But yet at that same time that we were saying those things, we had millions of enslaved people that were not given life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so we have a contradiction in terms, contradiction from the very beginning, don't we? Based on principles, lamb-like principles, but speaking like a dragon. And the story continues here. And let's read what prophecy says would happen to this power. Revelation 13, verse 12. And he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. What do we have? We have the earth and the being led to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. We see a transition, a change taking place here. You know, it's somewhat like in Elijah's day. Elijah gave a message rebuking the problems in Israel of his time. And as he gave this message rebuking what was actually in Elijah's day, a church-state combination, disasters began to fall. Let's look here, verse 14, Revelation 13:14. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast, who was wounded by the sword and lived. What we see in prophecy is depicting that our nation, which is going to begin as this lamb-like power, is going to speak like a dragon and is going to cause an image to this beast power, this first beast of Revelation 13, to be erected. Now we have to ask ourselves, what is an image to the beast? Well, what is an image? An image is something that is like something else, isn't it? So an image, if you make an image or if you draw a picture that looks like it, it resembles something else, isn't it? So an image is a likeness of. And so when we see in Revelation 13 where it mentions a likeness of this first beast, what was this first beast? And we haven't unpacked all of this, but this first beast was a church-state combination. According to prophecy, our country was going to be led, or is going to lead rather, in forming some type of church-state combination. And the church and the state will unite to enforce religious practices. What are the events that could be happening? Well, I want us to remember back to Elijah's day. The nation was going against God's commandments, wasn't it? And that led to disasters coming upon the nation. And that led to Elijah getting blamed because he declared what was going to happen. Do you think a similar pattern could be followed today? Just skimming through Revelation, We find in this church-state union, her sins have reached to heaven. She lives luxuriously. She experiences natural disasters. God's judgments fall, and her riches come to nothing. Could you see a scenario like that happening today? Because of rebellion against God, because of disobedience to God's commandments, disasters come, God's judgments fall, and even greater disasters take place. And you can imagine what would happen if this is going on and people are beginning to say, we need to get back to God, which is true, but we cannot force people to get back to God, can we? We appeal to people to follow Jesus and to follow the Bible, but you cannot force it. So you can imagine as there's a spiritual decline, natural disasters, social chaos, economic difficulties lead up to this predicted church-state union. And Satan takes advantage of this with this introducing a great false spiritual revival, which I believe is represented, and we don't have time to unpack this right now, but I believe is represented by this fire coming down from heaven in Revelation 13 that we read about. I've got it here again. He performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. But this will be a false fire, a false revival that will lead people not to obedience, but will lead to disobedience. It will be playing on what happened in Elijah's day, but will not lead back to true worship of God. And so when we look at this, we see the United States Constitution guarantees liberty and freedom. But did you know that there are changes that are taking place? The First Amendment of the Bill of Rights of the Constitution says, among other things, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. But legal thinkers are beginning to think differently, and there's a movement in this country that is changing it. This is former Chief Justice William Rehnquist. Notice what he said. The wall of separation between church and state is a metaphor based on bad history. Now, he's entitled to his opinion, but I would strongly disagree with that statement because Jesus said, render to Caesar what is Caesar and to God what is God's. Also, when we look throughout history, all these ancient powers that we looked at, they were church-state combinations, and it brought persecution and disaster every time. Daniel 3 with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was a church-state combination, and it brought persecution against God's people. During the Dark Ages, there was a church-state combination, and it brought persecution and death to millions. And our founding fathers did not agree with that sentiment that we just read, that combining church and state is a good thing. Notice, for example, George Washington. Every man conducting himself as a good citizen being accountable to God alone for his religious opinions ought to be protected in worshiping the deity according to the dictates of, notice what it says, his own conscience, right? Not someone else's, but his own conscience. Benjamin Franklin, very witty individual, as we all know. When religion is good, it will take care of itself. When it's not able to take care of itself and God does not see fit to take care of it so that it has to appeal to the civil power for support, it's evidence in my mind that the cause is a bad one. And then we come down a little bit further, 100 years or so from there, and to Ulysses S. Grant. General Grant became President Grant. Notice what he says. Leave the matter of religious teaching to the family altar. The church and the private schools supported entirely by private contributions. Then notice what he says. Keep the church and state, what does it say? Forever separate. These are what these men in our history of our country have said. And of course, we could look at many others. But that sentiment is beginning to change in the world around us today. And this is something that was predicted by prophecy, that our nation would be foremost in leading to a church-state combination of some shape or form. We have a message to give just like Elijah. Elijah declared that obedience to God was what is important. But as these judgments came upon Elijah, guess who was blamed for these judgments? Elijah was blamed, wasn't he? Are you the one that's troubling Israel? That's what Ahab said to him. And Elijah said, I'm not troubling Israel, but you and your father's house, in that you have rejected God's commandments. And according to the prophetic scenario in Revelation, we see that God's people are going to be blamed for the judgments that are coming as a result of the disobedience of the world and our country as a whole. Notice who will be blamed. Revelation chapter 12, verse 17. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring. I don't have the rest of the verse, so I'm going to quote it. Who keep the commandments of God and the testimony of Jesus. And so here, who's going to be blamed in Revelation? It's those that are keeping the commandments of God and having the testimony of Jesus. Now, I want to ask a question. We looked at this some last night. But if the devil wanted to unite people religiously, what avenue or what approach would he use? Well, what approach has he used historically? When there was a lot of disasters coming upon ancient Rome, and there was a lot of division in ancient Rome, there was an emperor by the name of Constantine that really was trying to unite his empire. He was trying to unite the pagans, and he was trying to unite the Christians, and he was trying to thwart off these disasters that were coming. And guess what he did? According to history, you can look it up in any reputable history source, he passed what is known today as the First Sunday Law, a law requiring religious observance of Sunday. Now, it's interesting. If you look at our country, we have a very interesting history with this as well. When the Pilgrims came, it was illegal to kiss your child on Sunday because that was work. There were very strict laws. Those started to subside. Then they got worse again. The 1880s, there were people that were put in prison for gardening on Sunday. And so you see this, the 1880s, 1890s was a period where it was difficult in that time period. And then they subsided again. But do you know we're in an upswing again? Since about 1960, the Burger Court, Supreme Court, ruled that Sunday laws were constitutional. And now there is a push for them, or at least a movement for it once again. We read this last night. We won't read it right now. And notice this statement here. This is from there's Christian Coalition and things like this, leaders in this movement. If Christians unite, we can do anything. We can pass any law or any amendment, and that's exactly what we intend to do. Now, if we believe in religious freedom, we have to give religious freedom to those that don't believe the way we do, right? So there are, and you can read about it, Roger Williams, the founder, in this country at least, of religious freedom in Rhode Island, and he said we have to give religious liberty to the infidel, which would have been like an atheist then, and the Turk, which were Muslims, and anybody that believed differently. That was the foundation of it. Why? Because if you don't give freedom to everybody, really you don't have freedom at all. You only have freedom for a few that are in power. And so statements like this show that there are Christians today that are becoming stronger that want to force their views and their religion on others for the, quote, good of society. Notice this. This is from about 11 years ago, something like that. The North Dakota Catholic Conference has responded to criticism of a law restricting Sunday hours for businesses, saying the regulation benefits the whole of society. Notice the argument. It's good for everybody. But yet, if it's combining church and state, it's fulfilling prophecy that we just read about, where our country would lead to a combination of church and state. Another statement here, this is actually, this was an author that wrote a book, The Sabbath World. That's the book you can see in the background there. She wants to keep Sunday timeless. In a world of 24/7 commerce, she's pushing for a return to laws that would shut down business one day a week. And you know what? It sounds good, doesn't it? It sounds good because everybody is at a frantic pace, right? We do live in a 24/7 world. That's why I believe we need to follow the Bible and keep the Bible Sabbath. But I don't want to force somebody to do it because that would be restricting their liberty, right? I want to share what the Bible says and allow people to make their own convictions and decisions. But that is not what these thinkers are saying and thinking about today. They're wanting to force their brand, their ideas, which is Sunday observance, which is just what Constantine did to try to unite his empire and resulted in this church-state combination of the Dark Ages. And it's what the Bible is predicting is going to happen again. Pope John Paul II, about 22 years ago, wrote a papal encyclical letter that said Christians will naturally strive to ensure that civil legislation respects their duty to keep Sunday holy. Current Pope has also said something very similar. Time magazine. Notice I'm just showing you how it's not, this prophecy has not been fulfilled yet, but I want us to see how there are people thinking and talking about it right now. Time magazine, maybe those old blue laws, referring to Sunday closing laws, weren't so crazy after all. Just a couple years ago, 2 years ago actually, America, for the sake of its own emotional and spiritual welfare, for the sake of its own sanity, needs to restore the blue laws. What is that? Sunday closing laws. I am not advocating mandatory church going, notice parentheses, although it wouldn't be the worst idea, but rather simple restrictions on which businesses remain open on restrictions on which businesses remain open on Sunday. One other statement here. This also shows how it would unite everybody here. This is from a blog from a Baptist pastor 2 years ago. Last week, as an environmentalist around the world celebrated Earth Day, I was intrigued by the potential of a, quote, biblical solution to the problem of air pollution, a day of rest. As for the economic impact of businesses from being closed one day of the week, Chick-fil-A has done quite well by closing on Sundays. During the 70s, if you remember the gas crisis then, do you know what was promoted as a solution? Close on Sunday. Bible prophecy has predicted that our nation would rise. Our nation has arisen just like Bible prophecy has predicted. Bible prophecy has predicted that our nation would lead in a church-state combination. And we see the development of that today. And Bible prophecy has even indicated in what area it would be. It would be in the area that took place previously when Constantine tried to unite the empire with Sunday laws that go directly contrary to what God's word says, but is forcing religion on others. Now, what is our response to be? And I believe this will become, I had one other statement that I forgot here. This is a state senator from Arizona. Probably we should be debating a bill requiring every American to attend a church of their choice on Sunday to see if we can get back to having a moral rebirth. These things are being talked about. Prophecy predicted this 2,000 years ago. Are we fully there yet? No, we're not fully there yet. But on the basis of prophecy, I believe that is the direction we're going. And we are going to be blamed for the judgments coming upon this world because we are following God's commandments just like Elijah was blamed when he was following God's commandments. Humanity loves a scapegoat. And Elijah was persecuted as a result. And the Bible talks about a persecution coming when you can't buy or sell and things like that. And that is what, according to prophecy, is coming next. But I want to conclude with just an important thought as we think about this whole subject. God is going to have a people. They're described in Revelation 12:17. They're described right here in Revelation 14:12. He's going to have a people, and it says, here is the patience of the saints. Here are those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. God is going to have a people that are going to keep God's commandments and the faith of Jesus. Even when the devil throws everything he can against them, even when the world tries to blame them and persecute them, God is going to have a people that are going to stand for God and his commandments because they love and follow Jesus no matter what. I want to be in that group of people, don't you? And the attitude that we must have is the attitude that Peter and John and the other apostles had. They said, we ought to obey God rather than man. God is calling us to obey him above what man says. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood firm when they were commanded to disobey what God said. But they stood firm. And God is calling us to stand firm like they did today. I want to be among that group that obey God no matter what. Is that the group you want to be among? May we be faithful to God. May we stand for God. May he give us the courage now that we can stand for him no matter what the cost is.